All three kingdoms shall hold together in unity and love. War between them shall never be possible again. They shall forever have the same king, God willing. These quotes are part of the Kalmar Union Charter we mentioned in the last episode. As history will tell us, God was not willing. Internal struggles had appeared even before the Union was formed, and with both Queen Margaret and King Erik gone, these tensions would continue. In this episode, we will see the Union strain, fracture, and finally shatter, ending in one of the most infamous events in Scandinavian history, the Stockholm Bloodbath. So let us explore the tumultuous end to the Kalmar Union. When we last left off, Erik of Pomerania had been ousted, and by 1442 he had been replaced as king of all three kingdoms by Christopher of Bavaria. Christopher was Erik's nephew on his sister's side, so while he had a link to the previous Scandinavian kings, this link was weak at best. Unlike Erik, who had been crowned as Union King at Kalmar in 1397, Christopher had to settle for three separate coronations. Symbolically, this weakened the idea of a united monarchy. King Christopher has this of Bavaria suffix in the history books, so how did he mess up? Well, here again we face something we've seen before: biased sources. Our main source for Christopher's rule is the Karl Chronicle. The Karl in question is Karl Knutsson of the House Bonde, King Christopher's main rival in Sweden, who commissioned the work. So take this portrayal of Christopher with at least a couple of grains of salt. Here we need to take a quick pause to talk about Scandinavian nobility and their names, with a focus on the Swedes. This is to understand why we sometimes see different versions of a prominent person's name. Scandinavian surnames are traditionally patronymic, meaning that the names are derived from the father. If Karl has a son named Erik, his name will be Erik Karlsson. If he has a daughter named Anna, she will be known as Anna Karlsdotter. By the 1900s, all but Iceland had abandoned this tradition. So a Swede named Erik Karlsson today doesn't necessarily have a father named Karl. And then we have the noble houses. Sweden has a number of such houses, some very old, while other new ones will crop up along our journey forward from here. Spoiler alert, the introduction of new noble houses will lead to protests from the older houses and sometimes conflicts. I'm sure you're shocked. These are houses well known to many Swedes, like Oxenstierna, Vasa, Tre Rosor, Natt och Dag, and Karl Knutsson's own house, Bonde. In Swedish historical writing, he is most often known as Karl Knutsson Bonde, while a man we will come to know later, Gustav Eriksson of the House Vasa, is most often known simply as Gustav Vasa. These distinctions are there to differentiate these individuals from others bearing the same names. While these house names weren't used in casual conversation, Karl wouldn't introduce himself as Karl Knutsson Bonde. They were also not just fancy names. Many of them wielded great power, both in their own right and through connections to other noble houses, both in Sweden and abroad, via intermarriage and alliances. They will also, very often, butt heads with each other, as we will see. With this in mind, let us get back to our story and King Christopher's rule. As mentioned, most of our knowledge of his reign comes from the Karl Chronicle. It paints him as responsible for heavy taxes that were sent to Denmark rather than favoring the Swedish kingdom. King Erik had done the same. Famines caused by bad harvests are also blamed on Christopher, giving him the not so favorable nickname Barkarkungen, the king of bark. This was due to people supplementing the grain from poor harvest with tree bark to make so-called bark bread, You can survive on Margaret, barely, but the nutritional value is, to put it mildly, marginal. Blame or not, Christopher appears to have been very restrained in his rule. He didn't enforce much of his royal power, but let the local councils of the realm, the councils of powerful nobles, govern each kingdom for the most part. His king's pledge, the written assurance to the Council of the Realm of Sweden, contains such restraints as Christopher having to abide by Swedish laws and customs in his rule. Sweden is again the more independent odd one out of the Union. In January of 1448, Christopher passed away, aged 31. It's unsure what killed him, but it was likely something natural, like a disease or infection, rather than foul play. His death did, however, leave the door wide open for the other player of our story, Karl Knutsson Bonde, to make his move. Karl was a Swedish nobleman with large holdings in the eastern part of the kingdoms, in what is now Finland. These holdings and the title of Lord High Constable, responsible for military affairs and defense, had been gifts given by Christopher at his coronation, as compensations for Karl losing the chance to become Lord High Steward or Regent, the acting head of state during the absence of a king. This made Karl a considerable power of his own within Sweden. And since it's Sweden we're talking about here, he naturally wasn't the only ambitious player in town. In the same year, 1448, another pair of noblemen, brothers Bengt and Nils Jönsson of the rivaling house of Oxenstierna, had very similar plans. Before Christopher's body had even cooled, the pair got themselves elected as co-regents of the Swedish realm. Only a month later, Bengt's son Jöns was elected as Archbishop of Uppsala, making him the Archbishop of the whole of Sweden. This concentrated the vast majority of Swedish political power within the Oxenstierna family. Nepotism, thy name is Swedish aristocracy. In June of 1448, Karl arrived from Finland to Stockholm with a military escort. In what has been described as a coup, he managed to take the power from the Oxenstierna brothers and get elected as King of Sweden. His ambition was to secure the union under a Swedish king. The Danes, of course, had other plans. The Danish Council of the Realm elected a German named Christian as king. Christian I, as his royal title would be, became the first Danish king from the House of Oldenburg. This house would come to rule Denmark for the next 400 years, and today has blood ties to many of the current European royal houses. The Kalmar Union's founding agreement promised that the three kingdoms would forever have the same king. That promise was now in shambles as the Union had two of them. Well, this is awkward. It also put the Council of the Realm in Norway in a bind. Should they ally with Karl? With Christian? Or should they strike out on their own path and elect their own king? As it turns out, however, it wouldn't really be up to them in the end. Norway's choice and the clash between Karl and Christian would ignite a conflict that culminates in one of Sweden's most famous battles, Brunkeberg, 1471. Begun, the Union Wars have. Both Karl and Christian had farther reaching ambitions than just remaining kings of their respective kingdoms. For a short time between 1449 and 1450, Karl was elected and crowned as King of Norway. This was only with support of a portion of the Norwegian Council of the Realm, and the Swedish aristocracy was not ready to back Karl in an all-out war with Denmark over the Norwegian throne. So, in the summer of 1450, Karl had to cede the throne to Christian. On the 29th of August, Denmark and Norway signed the Bergen Treaty, tying the two kingdoms closer together. It can be seen as a continuation of the Kalmar Union Charter signed in 1397. The two kingdoms would forever, quote unquote, have the same king, but the local council of the realm would govern Norway and her internal affairs. For a while, anyway, but that's a story for another time. Still, there was the problem of there being two kings in the Union. A peaceful compromise to this conundrum was agreed upon in Halmstad, the Halmstad Congress in May of 1450. Part of this compromise was the mentioned secession of Norway to Denmark, and another part was about what would happen later. The Union would once again have a single king, so once either Karl or Christian died, the other one would take over. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, why wait when you can just try and kill the other guy? So Christian chose violence. This would mark the beginning of a series of conflicts collectively known as the Union Wars. In 1451, Danish troops conquered Lödöse and Elfsborg, sealing Sweden's only path to Kattegat, the waters north of the Öresund Strait. Christian and his allies harassed Swedish merchant ships in the Baltic Sea, outright piracy more or less, and also ravaged southwestern Sweden, cutting deep into Karl's power base. To complicate matters even further, King Christopher had granted his wife Dorothea a vast dowry. The region around Örebro, including Närke and Värmland. After Christopher's death, Dorothea married Christian, giving him a legal claim to these lands. So Christian now controlled a significant part of a kingdom that refused to recognize him as king. In order to counter Christian and strengthen Sweden's finances, Karl reclaimed land that in earlier times had been granted to the church. This turned out to be a very poor decision. In 1457, Karl was ousted as king in a rebellion and went into exile in the Hanseatic city of Danzig, modern-day Gdansk in Poland. The instigator of this rebellion was Jöns Bengtsson Oxenstierna, the Archbishop of Uppsala that we met previously. He and Erik Axelsson of the House Tott were elected as regents with the intention of crowning Christian as King of Sweden, reassembling the Kalmar Union. Before Christian could ascend to the throne, he, like Christopher before him, had to sign a king's pledge. This pledge assured that Christian would follow Swedish laws in Sweden and respect the privileges of the Swedish aristocracy. No unjust taxes could be levied, and any tax-exempt noble landholdings would remain undisturbed. Again, a thing that sounds good on paper but is difficult in reality. Christian had the upper hand by having a strong military presence and could keep the aristocracy in check. Tensions grew over the years, with the last straw being a ship tax introduced in 1463, where Sweden needed to supply Christian with naval vessels. Archbishop Jöns rebelled, again, and promised to get rid of this tax, but was captured by Christian and brought to Denmark before he could take action. In the next year, 1464, Jöns' cousin Ketil Karlsson of the House Vasa and Bishop of Linköping instigated another rebellion against Christian. Christian came back to Sweden with a large military force, but lost the battle at Haraker in Västmanland, eventually allowing Karl to, temporarily, regain the Swedish crown. He would lose it again to Christian in 1465. This back and forth would continue until Karl's death in 1470. His cause of death was unspecified at the time, but most historians agree that he likely died from natural causes, no foul play. At this point, we have no less than 3 factions vying for power in the Union. The first faction is the Union monarchy, represented by Christian, and the second is the House of Oxenstierna. The third, so far unmentioned faction is the houses of Tott and Trolle. These were allies of Karl. Axel Pedersen Tott, a Danish councillor, fathered no less than 9 sons. These sons would be major actors in Nordic politics for decades and would collectively be known as the Axel sons. They built up vast holdings in both Sweden and Denmark and were therefore very interested in maintaining the union. One of the Axel sons, Ivar, married Karl's daughter Magdalena in 1466. Another Axel son, Åke, married off his daughter Ingeborg to Karl's nephew Sten Sture, further strengthening the alliance. This man would become known to history as Sten Sture the Elder, due to there being another Sten Sture, now known as Sten Sture the Younger, who will show up later in our story. With Karl now out of the picture, it was time for Sten Sture to make his move. At the time of his death in 1470, Karl had a small son, also named Karl, with his mistress. Kings and nobles don't tend to be very creative when it comes to names. King Karl would later marry his mistress, legitimizing the young Karl Karlsson. It is possible that the young Karl was intended as an heir to the throne, but alas, Sten Sture had been put in to guard the boy's interests, but instead took the power himself. Sten Sture was elected regent of Sweden by midsummer of 1471. The Axel sons appear to have accepted this move and took no actions themselves. Christian, on the other hand, did. After all, the Halmstad Congress, now over 20 years in the past, had concluded that once either Karl or Christian had died, the other one would take over as king of the Union. The Swedish crown rightfully belonged to Christian. He traveled to Stockholm with an army, again, to take back the crown. Negotiations were held, overseen by the recently elected Archbishop Jakob Ulfsson, but to no avail. Both parties, Christian and Sten Sture, were preparing for battle. At 11 o'clock on October 10th, 1471, Sten Sture and his army, consisting of about 1,000 mounted nobles and 8,000 peasants and regular infantry, attacked Christian's camp at Brunkeberg, near what is now Hötorget in Stockholm. Christian was outnumbered, his own army consisting of about 3,000 regular infantry, both Swedes and Danes, and another 3,000 German mercenaries. The battle was long and brutal, and it ended in a decisive victory for Sten Sture. Christian, bruised and battered, due to taking a shot from an arquebus, a type of hand cannon, to the jaw, knocking out several teeth, had to limp his way back to Denmark. The Battle of Brunkeberg is important in Swedish history for two main reasons. One, the use of infantry. During the Middle Ages, the mounted cavalry of the nobles had been the warrior elite, but by the 15th century, technological advancement had improved range weaponry, bringing in not only the arquebus, which were rare, but also the crossbow. A decently trained peasant with a crossbow could easily take out an armored knight with a well-aimed bolt. Put a few thousand of these peasants on the field, and suddenly knights aren't so invincible. This turning point in history is seen as a kind of rebirth for the infantry, and it made clear the importance of having the peasants, the commoners, on your side. The second reason, and most important from a Swedish perspective, was the framing of this battle as a nationalistic defeat of the evil Danish usurper, a battle for Swedish independence. This rather rosy depiction of events is a later construction, another victim of the natural romanticism of the 19th century. Sten Sture's reasoning lay most likely in strengthening his own power. The mountain men and peasants of Dalarna that made up the bulk of his army likely had economic reasons. They didn't exactly have good experiences with the Union kings anyway. Just look at the Engelbrekt rebellion in our last episode. The type of Sweden versus Denmark nationalism that we think of today will come along much later, and that is a story for another time. To celebrate this victory, Sten Sture had a monument erected at the Nikolai Church, modern-day Storkyrkan, the Grand Church, in Stockholm, and he took inspiration from a warrior saint, Sankt Göran och draken, St George and the Dragon. The monument depicts St George, modeled after Sten Sture himself of course, mounted on a horse slaying the evil dragon. To the side is a woman representing the city of Silene. The symbolism is rather obvious. Sten Sture is the brave hero defeating the evil dragon Christian, and in doing so saved the Swedish kingdom, Silene. The monument is still there, and if you're ever in Stockholm, you should pay it a visit. And as a side note, this is the same St. George who is the patron saint of England. Warrior saints like him are often used to build up your own image. But Sten Sture's victory didn't end the Union struggle. It only set the stage for decades of shifting alliances and bloodshed. And as for that dragon, Denmark wasn't slain just yet. While these internal struggles raged in Scandinavia, the world outside the peninsula wasn't standing still either. So let's take a moment to look into that. When Norway's political power decreased during the Kalmar Union era, interest in the politics of the Atlantic also diminished. The Norwegian fleet hadn't been assembled since 1393 when defending against the German pirate attack on Bergen. That fleet suffered a crushing defeat against a far more modern force. Orkney and Shetland, part of the Norwegian realm since the Viking Age, was pledged by Christian to Scotland in 1468 to 69. Christian pawned them as collateral for his daughter Margaret's dowry, as she was betrothed to King James III of Scotland. Their value was about 58,000 Reich florins. Hard to convert into modern money, but in the 15th century that sum could buy you a castle, a dozen warships, and the soldiers to crew them, with money to spare. The actual dowry was never paid by Christian, so in 1472 the Scottish Parliament absorbed the islands into the Scottish kingdom. They would in time become Scottish and British, losing their connection to the Norse roots. Today, only their Nordic cross flags whisper of a Norse past long absorbed into Scotland and Britain. The same fate could have faced Iceland and the Faroe Islands, which were under pressure from the English at the time. This activity caused tensions between the English crowns and the Scandinavian kings, but the English lacked the political will to take control over the North Atlantic islands. There was also the English trade across the Öresund Strait into the Baltic Sea, which was growing in significance. Danish control of the Öresund meant that Denmark could simply close the strait to the English ships, locking them out of the Baltic entirely, which acted as an incentive for the English to recognize Iceland and the Faroes as Norwegian. Icelandic historian Björn Thorstensson has described this as Iceland being kept under Nordic control by the Öresund Lock. To the south, relations were more stable. The nobility of Schleswig and Holstein, due to the lack of heirs, came together in 1460 and elected Christian as Duke of Schleswig and Count of Holstein. Holstein would become a duchy in 1474. In the agreement, it was said that Schleswig and Holstein would zusammen ungeteilt bleiben, remain together undivided. This used to be seen as an expression of national German-speaking unity, but has recently been seen as something more practical, simply the promise of Christians' duty to keep the local nobility in check and their infighting to a minimum. Elsewhere, there was a new power rising in the east. Novgorod, for centuries a thorn in Sweden's eastern side, was conquered in 1478 by the expanding Grand Principality of Moscow. This effort was led by the Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan III. He is a very important character in Russian history, being responsible for, amongst other things, making the double headed eagle the coat of arms of Russia, and the introduction of the title of Tsar, a Russian version of Caesar used by earlier Slavic rulers, to his ever expanding realm. He also adopted the idea of Moscow being the third Rome, with Constantinople being the second. The city was seen as the new bastion for the Christian faith, but not just any kind of Christianity. The Muscovites, like Novgorod, were Orthodox rather than Catholic. It might seem minor today, but at the time it made the difference between friends and enemies, the devout and the heretic. The Catholic European powers now had a new powerful rival in Eastern Europe. Back home in Scandinavia, Sten Sture used the victory at Brunkeberg to consolidate his power. He gathered great amounts of holdings and manors under his own control, as well as the castles of Stockholm, Örebro, and Åbo. Like with other rulers of his era, he used his political power to gain great personal wealth, more than for any well being of the greater Swedish realm. In this era, the line between public duty and private gain was almost non existent. The Axel sons also took part in the spoils of victory, gaining control over holdings like Viborg, Tavastehus, and Gotland. Ivar Axelsson, married to Karl Knutsson's daughter Magdalena, ruled Gotland like his own little kingdom, raiding Hanseatic shipping and even waging war against the Teutonic Order in the Baltics. But that is a story for another time. King Christian never again laid any claim to the Swedish crown. The question of the Union monarchy, however, would remain. Christian passed away in 1481. The Danish crown, and later also the Norwegian, passed to his son, Hans I. Hans would pick up his father's cause to reunite the Union. In the meantime, Sten Sture's actions had garnered him many enemies, among them the Axel sons. As they controlled many holdings along the Danish Swedish border, they were very invested in remaining on good terms with the Union kings. Tempting Hans with the crown of Sweden could definitely help in this regard, but that crown would come with a whole bundle of strings attached. At the recess of Kalmar in 1483, it was decided that Hans would have little to do with the actual governing of Sweden. Taxes would remain under control of the Council of the Realm. He would have nothing to do with the appointments to church positions. This agreement, if you can call it that, would at the time lead nowhere, and Sten Sture would remain in charge of Sweden for the time being. While Union politics simmered, external threats loomed in the east. Ivan III's expanding Russian Empire was starting to encroach on the eastern borders of Finland. To counter this, the defenses were bolstered. The castle of Viborg was expanded, and there was a new castle, Olofsborg, built in Savolax. This fortress was one of the late Middle Ages' largest construction projects. The Russians, though, believed it was placed on the wrong side of the border. This claim came from their interpretation of the Treaty of Göteborg, a peace treaty between Sweden and the Novgorod Republic back in 1323, over 180 years earlier. So the claim is rather spurious. True claim or not, this led to Russian attacks and raids in Finland in 1495 and 1496. Though the resulting ceasefire led to no territorial changes, it took a great toll on the Swedish realm, and the relationship between Sten Sture and his opponents. As an interesting note, this defensive war against Russian aggression was seen by Sten Sture and the Swedish Church as a crusade. The Russians, after all, were non-Catholic schismatics who, according to the Catholic Church, had broken with the true Christian faith, which made them a legitimate target. After the war in Finland, Archbishop Jakob Ulfsson demanded Sten Sture's resignation. On the 28th of September 1497, Sten Sture and his allies lost the Battle of Rotebro against King Hans, and Sten Sture was finally forced to resign as regent and relinquish the crown to Hans. The Kalmar Union was whole again. How long do you bet it will stay together this time? As it turns out, it would be about 4 years until the next rebellion came knocking. 2 of them this time. In 1501, Norway failed and Sweden succeeded to rebel against King Hans. The Swedish reason this time was that Hans, allegedly, hadn't kept his end of the deal that had been agreed upon in Kalmar in 1483. Hans' queen Kristina was captured and held hostage at Vadstena in Sweden. Negotiations resulted in Sten Sture regaining his position as regent of Sweden. This time he didn't keep it for long though, as he died in 1503. In his place, the Council of the Realm elected Svante Nilsson of the house Natodog as regent. He was just as opposed to Hans as Sten Sture had been, and the tensions continued. Svante's position was all but stable when he himself died in January of 1512. His detractors elected Erik Trolle as regent. Svante's son Sten inherited his father's estates and ran something of an aggressive marketing campaign among the peasants to make himself regent instead. As you will remember, keeping the peasants on your side had become a necessity by this time. While he was of the house Natodog, he took the name Sten Sture, making him Sten Sture the Younger, tying himself to the previous Sten Sture, the Elder. After intense negotiations, the younger Sten Sture got elected as regent in the middle of 1512. After all, it was he who held the military might, and might is the ultimate authority from which all other authorities derive. The dispute over the rule of Sweden and its relation to Denmark and the Union lingered. King Hans died in 1513 and was succeeded by his son, Christian II. Christian's rule and actions would make him known in Swedish history as Tyrant, Christian the Tyrant. Sten Sture the Younger, we'll just call him Sten Sture from now on, kept his aggressive stance as regent. His main opponent in Sweden, the aging Archbishop Jakob Ulfsson, aged 80 at the time, decided to resign and appoint his own successor. The choice fell on the son of the deposed regent Erik Trolle, Gustav Trolle. This young man could keep up the church's fight against Sten Sture. One component of the conflict was the archbishop's castle at Almarestäket. This was positioned as a strategically important waterway in Lake Mälaren. It also came with an accompanying fief, a large land area, giving the church considerable worldly power. Sten Sture opposed this, accused the young archbishop of conspiring with King Christian, and laid siege to Almarestäket. The castle was torn down in the coming years and is today nothing but a ruin. This confrontation between regent and archbishop opened the door for Christian II to intervene. He took a Danish force up to Stockholm and laid siege to the city in 1518. The siege failed, and after a ceasefire, Christian was forced to return to Denmark. He took with him a group of nobles as hostages, one of whom will become very important later on. Gustav Trolle had been captured at Almerstäket, marked as a traitor, and deposed as archbishop by Sten Sture in 1517. His replacement was the Italian Gianangelo Archimboldi. Archimboldi's appointment introduced an important change. Sten Sture redirected all church revenue to himself. This change was radical at the time, as the church was traditionally seen as independent and free from worldly influence. Ideally, anyway, there are tons of examples where that wasn't the case at all. King Christian returned to Sweden with a larger force in January of 1520. In the battle on the ice of Lake Åsunden, Sten Sture was gravely wounded and he later died from his injuries on his way back to Stockholm. The Stockholm burghers, city dwellers, led by Sten Sture's widow Kristina Gyllenstierna, were eager to continue the fight against the Danish king. Christian laid siege to the city again in September. He managed to get recognized as King of Sweden under the same rules as the previous Union kings. Follow Swedish laws in Sweden and don't introduce any new taxes without the consent of the Council of the Realm. In late September, Stockholm surrendered. Kristina and her followers received amnesty. As it turned out, Christian's promise was a hollow one. In October, he forced the nobles to accept him as king and that Sweden would shift from being an elective to a hereditary monarchy. This is not just a political maneuver, it marked the end of Sweden's centuries-old tradition of elective monarchy, and the change remains to this very day. Christian was crowned King of Sweden on November 4th, 1520, by the reinstated Archbishop Gustav Trolle. After the coronation, there was a feast at the castle Tre Kronor, 3 crowns, for several days. Suddenly, on the 4th day, the gates to the castle were sealed. No one was allowed to leave. Archbishop Gustav Trolle appeared and accused many of the nobles, bishops, and burghers present of heresy. The punishment for that is execution. According to some sources, one nobleman was late for the festivities and, not knowing what was going on, demanded to be let into the castle, sealing his fate. Erik Johansson of the House Vasa. A man that did escape the executioner's sword, according to the legend, was Hans Brask, the Bishop of Linköping. He had been a part of the deposing of Gustav Trolle as Archbishop, but had, according to a note he had hidden under his seal, done so under duress. The small note said, "Härtill är jag nödd och tvungen. To this I am forced and compelled." This legend has given rise to the modern Swedish term of a brasklapp, a brask note. Such a note can be used to indicate that there can be exceptions to otherwise clear statements. The executions were carried out at Stortorget, the Grand Square, between the 8th and 9th of November. In total, around 80 to 90 people were executed. The sources vary. The method was, if you excuse the term, medieval. Decapitation by axe, or by sword if you were a noble. With executioners often drunk, the killings were anything but swift. Several executions required multiple strikes before the headsman chopped off the head, often missing and striking the subject in the back instead. Witnessing this spectacle must have been gruesome. Decapitating someone also leads to a lot of blood spraying all over the place, and according to some sources, Stortorget ran red with it, even up to people's ankles. This event has been remembered as the Stockholm Bloodbath and sealed Christian's reputation as a tyrant. A side note before we move on, there is something of an urban legend that Christian was known as Christian the Tyrant in Sweden, while he was Christian the Good in Denmark. This is, however, untrue. he was cruel to his Danish subjects too. So, now that heads quite literally had been rolling, Christian felt secure in his rule and that he had removed all of his enemies. However, he had missed someone, a young nobleman who wasn't present at Stockholm but would in time become a major threat to Christian and eventually shattered the Kalmar Union for good. The man would turn tyranny into freedom. Gustav Eriksson Vasa.